Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Amitava Chatterjee. Migratory birds need habitat to rest and feed in during their long journeys. Farmers can help these frequent flyers by flooding their fields in fall and winter, but more insight is needed on how these important conservation practices may affect their field conditions. In this episode, Amitava joins me to discuss his work studying flooding effects on farmers' fields. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. Today we have Amitava Chatterjee with us. Amitava did his master's in soil science from India. He came to the United States for his PhD in soil science from the University of Wyoming. He was faculty in the soil science department in North Dakota State University. He joined USDA ARS as a research soil scientist in 2021. His research is focused on greenhouse gas emissions and soil and water management. Hi Amitava, how are you doing today?
Doing good.
Wonderful. We are so happy to have you on the show today. Before we launch in, I know you wanted to give a little credit on some funding, so I'll let you go ahead and do that before we dive in on our topic.
So this project was supported by the funding from the Reimbursable Cooperative Agreement with the University of Mississippi as part of the Environmental Protection Agency's Farmer to Farmer program.
Awesome. Thank you to those programs for funding this awesome research. So today we are talking about a pretty cool thing that is pairing good, healthy farming with good care for the earth and the animals that live there. So can you just start off by telling us a bit about the problem that your research was hoping to address?
So we conducted this research in the Delta region of the Mississippi River. So the migratory flyway, they are crucial for migratory birds because they provide the breeding, feeding, and wintering during their long migrations. The Mississippi deltas has diverse habitats, including wetlands and marshlands. They offer the vital resources for these migratory birds to support their successful migration. And we are having issues with their habitats nowadays. So we are trying to find out an alternative way to use agriculture land when it is not under production, crop production, to use as their habitat during the winter. So we can give them the more opportunity for these migratory birds for their habitats.
Okay. And how long have farmers been engaging in this process? Is this like a long-standing tradition? Is this kind of in reaction to some new things that have been happening? What's going on there?
It has been a common practice in these areas to use this winter flooding as for the habitat for the migratory birds. But nowadays, it is becoming more and more common, and NRCS is encouraging this practice because they like to have two-way benefits from this practice. One is that recharging the groundwater. Another one is that they like to provide an habitat for these migratory birds.
Okay. And how do farmers create this flooded thing? I mean, are they building walls? Are they just dumping a bunch of water there? Are these areas naturally, I was going to say curvy, but that's not what I mean. Do they have natural indentations in the land that would be suitable for flooding? That's how I meant to phrase that question. How do they go about this?
Well, it is common kind of query about the general people public that, okay, whether we should really add water, because then it is not going to be sustainable, right? So what we do generally that these farmers, they do in winter, they temporarily flood, not like that common, continuous flooding. They just do that thing during the winter, like October to February. When they are done with the main crop harvest, they flood their agricultural land using the tailwater recovery system. It is a conservation practice promoted by NRCS, where what they do, they collect the irrigation, excess amount of irrigation water, rainwater, and they may keep that water, excess water, in a pond. Then they use that water for this winter flooding. So it is not like that we are kind of doing a surplus irrigation, or we are kind of adding more water from other resources. It is just like reusing the same water that they are using it for irrigation. Another one is that they are doing it passive flooding. They have a riser board, or they just put an impeding for the outflow of water from the field, and so that they can store the water, rainwater. So they call it passive kind of flooding. And another is that active flooding, where they use their this tailwater recovery system to flood their field during the winter.
Okay, cool. I like that. It's a very recycling heavy kind of idea. I love that. So you were interested in looking at how this flooding is going to be interacting with soil properties and nutrient availability over time. So can you give us a high-level look at your hypothesis and what you were hoping to test specifically?
Sure. So farmers, they are sometimes skeptical about that, whether this flooding, winter flooding, they might kind of lead to the loss of nutrients, or whether they are going to have some issues in the long term. So for that reason, they just want to know more about it for the full-fledged adoption of this conservation practices. So what we like to do it here, our overall objective or our overall goal is that we like to find out that if we are doing this winter flooding, and depending on the duration, that how long we are going to keep this winter for winter flooded, and how it is going to impact on the soil properties like soil pH and soil carbon dioxide flux or loss of carbon and decompositions of litter. Means overall the processes and the properties, how they are affected by this winter flooding, so that we can call it as it has some sustainability, whether there is any kind of negative impacts on these soils on a long term or not. So that we like to investigate.
Sure. And how did you go about it?
So what we did, we just used farmers' land in the Mississippi Delta that is nearby Sunflower Town. It is nearby that Indianola, just like so that people can identify. Sunflower is a really small town. And we selected 5 neighboring fields. Each field is around 15 hectares. So it is not like a small plot study. It has a really big plots that we kind of considered as each unit of treatment. Then what we did, we just flooded these fields in different ways. First one is that, as we mentioned about passive flooding, just to kind of for that, so that I just repeating that one, that we are for passive flooding, we are storing the rainwater, not we are adding any water through pumping or other sources. That is called passive flooding. That is one treatment. Another 3 treatments are active flooding, but they are depending on 3 durations. Active flooding, as I mentioned, that we are pumping the water from the tailwater recovery to the field, and we are storing that water for the fall phase, that is starting from October to November, October 11th to November 15th. During 2022, we did this one. And then another one is during winter, that is November 29 to January 31st. And the third treatment under this active flooding is that we are considering that whole fall and winter together. That is October 11 to January 31st. And besides these 4 treatment, 1 passive and 3 active, we are having 1 control, that is we did not add any water. So overall, we have 5 types of treatments.
Sure. And what were you testing for these different soil and nutrient and otherwise properties that you were studying?
So what we did before we started flooding, we went out there and collected intensive soil samples throughout this field to determine that soil properties, basic soil properties like soil pH, total carbon and nitrogen, and enzymes activities that we consider that it is going to be influenced by this flooding or anoxic conditions or lack of oxygen. So whenever you are flooding, you are creating a barrier so that oxygen cannot really flow from the environment to the soil. So those are the properties that we selected. So first one is that is going to affect that we are focusing on this carbon, nitrogen, and pH. Then the second one is that soil carbon dioxide efflux that we measured, because we believe that as we are creating an anoxic conditions, anaerobic environment, microbial activity will be down. The third one that we measured is that decomposition process or crop residue decompositions, because although we generally ignore the crop residues because we think it as a kind of a burden, but crop residue can be a source of food and energy for the microbial community, and it is also returning nutrients to your soil. So we are measuring this soil crop residue decomposition, particularly for here we use the corn residues to find out that how this flooding is going to affect on this decomposition process.
Sure. And when you are talking about this corn residue or litter, is that, when you say it's feeding the microbes, is that the microbes that you would say would be feeding or would be creating kind of those escapements of, or efflux of the nutrients that you're looking for?
Absolutely. That is a really good point. So they are all interconnected. So flooding, you are creating the flooded or anoxic conditions. That is going to change your soil pH, right? Because you are increasing the concentration or this iron that is changing their charges. So because they are oxidized, now they're becoming reduced conditions. And when you are having that on conditions, then you are changing the soil nutrients, and that is also influencing your soil microbial communities because they use those nutrients, right? And then when you are changing these nutrients, they are influencing the microbial metabolism or breathing. So it depends on what kind of foods you are having. That depends on your that what you are going to breathing out, you know. So whenever you are having these anoxic conditions, another thing is that you are switching the microbial groups from aerobic that use the oxygen as a energy source or for their respiration to anaerobic microbial group. They can use other sources of oxygen. Suppose like they can take out the oxygen from the nitrates or oxidized metals for their respiratory or for their respiration. So that is that. What are the switches going on during these anaerobic conditions or lack of oxygen environment?
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Amitava's paper, Shallow Water Habitat Management Influences Soil CO2 Efflux from Agricultural Fields in the Lower Mississippi River Basin, LMRB, USA, published in Agrosystems, Geosciences and Environment, is always freely available. If you're a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, I really like that. There are many things I like about this research project, but that's really interesting. I love when science projects are just dealing with these really intricate like trade-off systems where you flip one switch and it can flip 8 other switches in the system all at the same time. So I am excited to hear about what you learned. So tell me about that. What did you all find out?
So what we find out that first of all that we are talking more about it that whenever we are creating an anaerobic environment that is going to change the soil pH. So what we find out that whenever we are creating this flooding condition for longer period of time during fall and winter, so from October to January 31st, that is actually increasing the soil pH towards neutral. So from acidic towards neutral. So we have a pH before flooding 5.3 and we are having pH after flooding 5.8. Not really like a big jump, but towards neutral. These soils are inherently acidic in nature. So if we are increasing the pH, that might favor some soil chemical reactions to improve the nutrient availability that we are hypothesizing here. Another thing is that when we are increase the soil pH of this one, then we can expect that it is also favors other soil microbial health also, because microbial groups, they favor this neutral rather than if you are having acidic soils or too alkaline conditions.
Sure. So I have a question. I know there's many other things that you were researching here. How does this factor in for the plants that you are growing? For example, I have some blueberry plants and they like more acidic soils. So are the crops that you're growing in these regions or fields, are they happy that it's acidic? In which case, kind of pushing it more towards neutral, they're going to be a little bit less happy? Or are they like, thank goodness, I would like it to be more neutral? Or is it just, or are the numbers that we're talking about, small enough of a range that they don't care? Or maybe if you kept doing it over time, it would matter. Can you talk to me a bit about that?
So these are good questions that if you are thinking, these fields are under corn soybean production, continuous corn soybean production. So, and these soils are inherently acidic, not like that they are having like we are adding some fertilizer so it becomes acidic, so we are kind of thinking about it. Not like that one, it is inherently acidic in nature. So whenever we are, suppose like flooding or we are adding lime, you are improving the soil aggregations because, if you are having, suppose like a little bit of alkaline conditions, that kind of favors other benefits for these soils also. Now you talk about these berries, they are fruit trees, they are favoring acidic soils, so they like some acidic condition in their soil. For corn and soybean, generally, if we are having the neutral conditions, then it is better because suppose like I'm just giving you an example. If for these particular soils, if you are having an acidic soil, then you will have more iron and aluminum in soil, and that binds phosphorus. So you might experience, or plants might experience, some deficiency of phosphorus in these soils. So it is our objective to keep soils neutral for general agricultural crop production.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I was thinking about that, and I don't know what corn and soybean needs, so I just figured I'd ask. So you also were looking at the carbon dioxide efflux and the residue composition. So can you tell me about those two also?
Yes, so I actually measured the soil CO2 flux 12 times during these flooding times and using a Likert CO2 analyzer in the field conditions, not like that I collected soil samples and measured in lab. So what I find out that around for 12 times, only like 4 or 6 times we found a significant difference between flooding versus non-flooding conditions. And what we find out that whenever we are flooded, particularly that fall winter, that soil CO2 flux reduced. So what we assume that whenever you are having the flooding, that microbial activity little kind of reduce, and that reduce the soil CO2 flux. That is one thing that we find out. On the other hand, we did that corn residue decompositions. To do that one, I just want to explain that how we did that thing. We put some corn stalk, piece of corn stalk in a nylon bag, And because it is flooded field, so that it does not move around, we tie that thing into a grill or a fence structure, so that it does not really move around and stays under the water. That is another thing that I like to point out. And retrieve that bags after 33 days of incubation, 69 days and 124 days of incubation, so that we can get a rate of decomposition or weight loss over time. Then we measure that what is the carbon and nitrogen in those loss after these different intervals. And what we find out, it is interesting that whenever we are having this fall and winter flooding, they actually increase some decomposition process or weight loss getting increased. Why we find out that thing, we kind of rationalize this finding is that when we are having this water added, particularly in this kind of soils, although it is anaerobic conditions, but they are getting moisture, they are getting these nutrient sources, so they are utilizing this corn residue as a food. So they are utilizing that labile carbon sources from these residues, and we are observing some mass loss or corn residue decomposition is fast as compared to totally dry condition or not flooded soils.
Sure. So obviously, the carbon dioxide emissions is, that's something that most people will recognize as an environmental issue at large. But for the corn residue, is it something where farmers are happy that it's decomposing faster? Is that something where they're like, well, if the microbes eat it, then the plants can't eat it later? Is it, I'm glad that it's getting off of my field faster, or, I don't want it there because it provides valuable cover that helps weeds from popping up? I mean, what do farmers have a vested interest in that side of things at all?
That is really a good question for this one, for like litter or residue decompositions. We don't want to decompose it way fast, so that it kind of produce a flush of carbon dioxide. That is not happening here, that I can tell you. The magnitude is higher whenever we are not having that field flooded, but it is not like a not really a huge flash of CO2 coming out whenever we are flooding this field, or we are not flooding that field, or there is not much of that much magnitude of effect. But as you mentioned, these residues, we don't want to stand them keep that thing intact, because if you don't have any moistures, they are going to be there forever, right? So we need some decomposition of that residue so that it can supply the nutrients. Now, one thing is that, well, if you have those residues standing on the surface, they can protect your soil from this erosion or other benefit aspects also, but we also need them to decompose over time. So if it is sitting there forever, then you have other negative impacts also. Suppose whenever if you are doing no-till, then you can have some skips in your seed whenever you are planting those planting. So those are the things that we need to remember, that there is not anything too much is not good for your soil. Means if it is that protecting residue is good. So whatever I'm kind of assuming that whenever we are seeing some loss of carbon, more carbon, or residual mass loss, particularly in case of flooding soils, they are giving some nutrients or supplying some carbons or nitrogens to the microbes that can give us more benefits for you can say that they can push that nutrient process or nutrient biogeochemical process to improve the nutrient availability or improve the soil health.
Good. Yeah, giving it a little bit of a nudge, but not too much, apparently.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, before we move on, was there any other research results that you wanted to share?
One thing is that I may need to make clear about that thing, that flooding reduced soil CO2 flux and decomposition increased. Just to make sure that I spelled it. I just convey that message clearly.
Good. So overall, did the migratory flyway flooding get a pass on its effects on soil and nutrient properties? Is this something that you would encourage people to look into? Are there this one? I will admit this is a little bit of a curveball, but is that something that you think is like something we can now look into expanding as a practice, or what other research needs to be done? What's going on with the future of this?
So one thing that take-home message, if you're asking me from this experiment, although it is just like during the winter experiment, but we did not observe a negative effect of flooding from this experiment. That is the first one. Another thing that we observe, whenever we are doing this flooding for long time, that fall and winter together, like October 31st to January, then you are getting more effect than if you are just restricted that flooding to fall or winter. Actually, winter flooding, that is means just only from November to January, is the common practice. But if we add some time up to this period, then it might give you more benefit than only winter flooding. That is one big take-home message. For future research, actually it is ongoing research. This is the first year that we did this experiment. We are doing more intensively soil sampling, measuring the enzyme activities. We are doing this field experiment to other soil types, so that we can find out that how these other soil types reacts or responds to this kind of flooding, different types of flooding. So that is ongoing. And another thing is that we only measure the CO2 flux, because having all other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide will be really critical to make any kind of conclusive statement about flooding practices.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense. I actually did have a question about the emissions. Do you find, or is there a possibility that if it's something where the anoxic environment may subdue certain kinds of emissions because there's that layer, but then like once the water goes away, there's like an increase because it was just kind of all stuck under there? Is that a thing that happens? I just wanted to ask about that. Or is that ongoing research maybe?
Really good question, actually. Yeah, really good question. Well, what we find out, as we did not measure the methane, whenever you are creating an anoxic conditions, there is a chance that you are going to get bunch of methane when you are reducing the carbon dioxide loss. Or you can find out that your nitrous oxide, that is a denitrification or anoxic, that really increased by this anoxic environment, that gets increased. Now, yes, that is a kind of area that needs to be researched. But one thing that I like to point out, as you mentioned, these soils are not really, because having bunch of carbon and nitrogens, just keep that, because these soils are a little acidic, and they are, after you harvest the corn particularly, there is not much of carbon, like labile carbon or labile nitrogen left over for this soil. So you don't expect bunch of carbon and nitrogen release as soon as your ponding or this flooding is done. And another thing is that as soon as this flooding is done, these farmers, they are trying to get ready for their planting. So it is just like if you have some excess nutrients released by these different processes, like increasing pH or favorable conditions, then it is going to favor the next crop. And that we did not measure. So that is one important thing, that how that is going to affect the following crop, this flooding that we have not measured. So that is a really important thing that we need to do.
Sure. And just for the non-experts among us, including myself, is labile, is that plant available nutrients?
Yeah, you can say that. I would say that is labile. It is just like plant available. It is mostly used for carbon, mostly labile carbon pool. That is mostly that we use for that carbon that microbes can use. Suppose like if you whatever food you are taking, you can just consider your Coke or soda as a kind of or any sugar, like simple sugar. They are ready to supply you energy or used by your body cells. So that we consider as labile carbon pool.
Okay.
Whereas there are other complex sugars that your body needs time to break down.
Okay, cool. Thank you for defining that. So this has been a great conversation so far. Before I move us on, was there any other future research you wanted to touch on, or did we kind of go over it?
I think I covered most of it, but there are other things that other researchers like Matt Moore from that Mississippi unit, Oxford unit, and Jason Taylor, they are following up. Like some of the researchers, they are counting birds, that how many birds are coming up for this different flooding treatments. And then other researchers like Matt Moore, he is also looking at pesticides, whether that flooding and non-flooding, how that is affecting on the pesticide movement. So there are other parts of this research, and there is a collaborator from the university from Mississippi. His name is Jason Huxema. He is actually following up on this migratory bird count and other aspect of this research.
Oh, that sounds like really fun, relaxing, pleasant research to count these birds and get to just observe them in their environment. And we did have Matt Moore on a previous episode. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that one, he talks about some chemicals and whether or not they stick around or get back on the field from tailwater recovery systems. So if you want a deep dive on that, which came up here also, I recommend listeners listen to that. So that, I think, is a great segue then to our final 3 questions. So the first one is if listeners want to learn more about any of the things that we have been talking about today. Obviously, they can look into some of that research you mentioned, but what else can they do to learn more?
Well, there are a lot of extension bulletins on wetland management of waterfowl, and there are some YouTube videos. I think that we are going to provide the link for those ones. And there is a link for this Mississippi Land Conservation Assistance Network, and there are a lot of resources from this Audubon Society and other resources that kind of focus on this migratory bird habitat and other management practices to promote that habitat in Lower Mississippi River Delta.
Great. Yeah, we will definitely include links to some of those in our show notes. So then the second question is if people want to take that next step and get involved, whether that is as citizens or as researchers, what can they do?
Well, they can definitely contact with this Mississippi Land Conservation Assistant Network, and they can help farmers to set up this waterfowl habitat or this flooding management, how they can improve that thing and how they can adopt these practices in their agricultural land. And that is one resource for that one. And also they can reach out to Jason Taylor. He is a research ecologist at Oxford USD ARS, and he can give you definitely some other contacts to adopt or to get more idea about this, how that they can be benefited from this winter flooding.
Awesome. That is some great advice for people looking to get in touch or get involved. So then our last question for you today is, what is one fun fact that listeners would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Yeah, well, I like to do a lot of stuff, and nowadays there are a lot of machine learning stuff going on and artificial intelligence. So one of that aspect that I'm trying to explore more is this machine learning, and also other thing is that just beyond all these things, sometimes you can get your inspiration from other areas. Like I just want to mention about this movie called Dune, and that I watched, and they have showed that how they harvest water in desert area, and they show that there is a big role of dew in agriculture that sometimes we miss. And I actually published an article from North Dakota State University. Their researchers, they find out that whenever we are having cover crops, they can help us to trap dews during this August or dry period, and that can help the main crop. So that those kind of things, that kind of fascinates me,
Nice. Yeah. I think, what is it in Dune? Water discipline? Is that what they call it?
Yeah, and actually they have a lot of ideas about these water things in part 2 also. But that part 1, that novel, actually, they talked about this, how this water resource is so important, and it is true for this research also, that we don't, because our aquifer below this Mississippi River, that is kind of depleting in a really fast. So we need to find out some way so that we can better use the water, particularly in the Delta region.
For sure. Good job, Dune, for sparking some inspiration for this research, as I'm sure this conversation will spark inspiration for other people. So thank you so much for being on the show today and sharing about your research. And just all that you're doing for Mississippi and beyond. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate Society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Surajit. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Hi, I am Surajit De, a graduate research assistant in the Department of Agronomy, Kansas State University. I am pursuing my doctoral degree in precision agriculture and forage agronomy.
Awesome. And what are you currently researching?
I am currently working on drought-resilient alfalfa production project funded by USDA. So I am currently researching to precisely manage water in alfalfa production in the southern Great Plains through developing spatial maps using crop water stress index and evapotranspiration.
Awesome. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
So my dream project should focus on developing water management strategies to build decision management tools for forage producers, which will help the producers to take decisions in water management. And I would also like to spread the message, like use water wisely to quench thirst, as careless flood drowns hope.
Awesome. Well, if you'd like to get in touch with Surajit about his work, we'll have his contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.